It was October 1817, and John Bell couldn't sleep. That wasn't unusual for a farmer in Robertson County, Tennessee. Exhaustion was part of the job, but this was different. He lay there in the dark, listening to something that shouldn't exist. A sound like rats gnawing inside the walls, except it moved with purpose, following him from room to room. When he sat up, it stopped. When he lay back down, it started again, closer this time, right behind his head. His wife Lucy stirred beside him and whispered, "Do you hear that?" And that's when they both realized the sound wasn't coming from the walls at all. It was coming from the space between them, from the empty air itself, breathing. Not the steady rhythm of human breath, but something irregular, deliberate, as if whatever was making the sound wanted them to know it was there, wanted them to feel its presence filling the room like smoke. John Bell was not a man who scared easily. He'd fought in territorial disputes, survived harsh winters, buried children lost to fever. He'd seen death, poverty, and violence. But lying there in the dark, listening to that impossible breathing, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the primal, animal fear that comes when you realize you're not the apex predator in your own home. This is the part where most families would have packed up and left. Gathered what they could carry, loaded the wagon in the middle of the night, and disappeared down the road before sunrise. The Bells didn't. They couldn't. Because whatever had entered their home that night wasn't just passing through. It had learned their names. It knew their secrets. It had studied them with the patience of something that existed outside of time, and it had no intention of leaving until it got exactly what it came for. Over the next 3 years, the Bell family would become the most documented case of supernatural terror in American history. Hundreds of witnesses. Dozens of written testimonies. Men of God, men of science, military heroes, skeptics and believers alike, all came to the Bell farm, and all left with the same haunted expression, the look of people who'd seen something that broke their understanding of how the world worked. But this wasn't just a haunting. It was a negotiation, a psychological warfare campaign waged by an entity that understood human weakness better than humans understood themselves. And the Bell Witch, as it came to be known, was winning. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a time when America was still stitching itself together, when Tennessee was considered the frontier, and Robertson County was where you went if you wanted land, freedom, and a life built with your own hands. The year was 1804 when John Bell, a respected farmer from North Carolina, moved his family to the Red River settlement. He wasn't running from anything. He was building toward something. John Bell had a vision, productive land, a strong family, a legacy that would outlast him. He was 35 years old, broad-shouldered and strong from a lifetime of physical labor, with the kind of steady, measured temperament that made other men trust him with their business and their secrets. By 1817, John Bell was a man of standing. He owned over 300 acres of fertile land along the Red River, raised livestock, grew tobacco and corn, and had earned a reputation as a fair-dealing, God-fearing man. His farm was prosperous, his harvests consistent, his livestock healthy. He was the kind of man neighbors came to for advice, for loans, for mediation in disputes. His word meant something. His wife Lucy was known for her kindness and sharp mind, the kind of woman who could deliver a baby, mend a fence, treat a fever with herbs, and still have supper ready before dark. She was John's equal in every way that mattered, strong where he was strong, soft where he needed to be hard. She kept the household running, managed the children with a firm but loving hand, and maintained connections with other families in the settlement. In a time when community meant survival, Lucy Bell was essential. They had 9 children. The oldest was Jesse, already grown and working the land alongside his father. Then came John Jr., strong and reliable. Drury, Esther, and then Betsy, their daughter Elizabeth, just turning 15 in 1817. She was coming into her own, pretty and spirited, with her mother's sharp wit and her father's stubborn determination. The kind of girl people remembered. After Betsy came Richard, Joel, and the youngest ones, still too small to understand what was about to happen to their family. The Bells attended the Red River Baptist Church every Sunday without fail. They worked hard, kept their word, and lived by the rules of a community that believed in providence, hard work, and the idea that if you did right by your neighbors, God would do right by you. This was before people blamed Wi-Fi for their problems, before psychology and neuroscience gave us comfortable explanations for the inexplicable. If something went wrong, it was the weather, the soil, or the devil himself, and most folks leaned toward the weather. Life was predictable in its difficulties. You planted in spring, prayed through summer, harvested in fall, and survived the winter. That was the rhythm. The rhythm that had governed human existence for thousands of years. Wake before dawn, work until your body ached, eat what you grew, sleep in the bed you built. The Bells had no reason to believe anything would disrupt it. Except they'd already started noticing things, small things, the kind you dismiss because admitting them feels worse than ignoring them. A dog barking at nothing, facing the woods with its hackles raised, refusing to move closer despite commands. A door that wouldn't stay latched, even after John reinforced the hinges. The feeling, just once or twice, that someone was standing behind you when the room was empty, that prickling sensation on the back of your neck that made you turn around quickly, only to find nothing there. Lucy mentioned it first, cautiously, the way you mention a troubling dream, not wanting to give it too much weight. "The house feels different," she said one evening, folding laundry. John looked at her, saw the concern in her eyes, and said what any practical man would say, "It's just settling. Old wood shifts." But he'd felt it too. A presence, subtle but persistent, like the feeling of being watched through a window. Nothing you'd mention at church. Nothing that would make you sound crazy or mark your family as unstable. But enough that John Bell started sleeping lighter, his hand sometimes reaching for the rifle he kept near the bed. And Lucy started praying harder, whispering entreaties in the dark when she thought no one was listening. They didn't know it yet, but something had already moved in. It had probably been there for weeks, maybe months, learning their patterns, studying their routines, understanding the architecture of their relationships and the fault lines of their secrets. It was watching them. Learning them. Waiting for the moment to introduce itself. And that moment was coming soon. It started with sounds. Not the usual creaks and groans of a wooden farmhouse settling in the cold, but sounds that seemed designed to get your attention, sounds that had pattern and purpose behind them. A scratching at the windows, slow and deliberate, as if something with claws was testing the glass, checking for weaknesses. The sound would move from window to window, circling the house like a predator stalking prey. The children heard it first. Betsy and her younger brothers Richard and Joel would wake up in the middle of the night and swear something was pulling at their blankets, tugging them toward the foot of the bed with insistent, rhythmic yanks. Not violent, not yet, but persistent. The first few times, they blamed each other, assuming it was a prank. But then it happened when they were all in the same room, all feeling the same sensation simultaneously, and the accusations stopped. John Bell, ever the skeptic, checked the house top to bottom. He inspected the walls for cracks, the attic for signs of animals, the cellar for structural damage. He set traps for rats, thinking maybe they'd nested in the structure and their movement was causing the disturbances. The trap stayed empty, but the sounds got louder, more insistent, as if whatever was making them was offended by his skepticism. Then came the knocking. It would start softly, 3 taps, evenly spaced, like someone politely asking to be let in. Tap. 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 A pause. Then again. Tap. 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 The family would freeze, listening, waiting to see if it would continue. When no one answered, it would escalate, pounding so hard the walls shook, dishes rattling on shelves, dust falling from the ceiling beams. The entire family would gather in the main room, staring at each other with wide eyes, because the knocking wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside, from the walls themselves, sometimes from multiple locations at once, as if there were dozens of invisible fists hammering in unison. John would grab his rifle and search the house, room by room, while Lucy gathered the children and prayed. They never found anything. No intruders, no animals, no explanation. Just silence, and then, minutes later, the knocking would resume, always just out of sight, always one step ahead. Objects began to move. A chair would slide across the floor when no one was near it, not tipping or falling, just gliding smoothly as if pushed by invisible hands. A Bible, left closed on the table, would be found open to a specific passage, always something about sin or judgment or the wages of transgression. Lucy's sewing needle disappeared from her hand mid-stitch and reappeared an hour later stuck into the kitchen table, standing upright like a tiny sword, embedded so deep it took John's strength to pull it free. The children started hearing voices. At first, they thought it was each other playing tricks, but the voices knew things. They'd whisper secrets no one had spoken aloud, intimate details about private moments, embarrassing incidents the children had hidden from their parents. They'd mimic the voice of their father calling them from another room, and when the kids responded, running to help with whatever he needed, John would be outside working, nowhere near the house, unaware he'd been impersonated. Lucy heard her own voice once, calling to Betsy from upstairs. "Betsy, come help me with the linens." Betsy started toward the stairs, but Lucy was standing right next to her in the kitchen, hand on her daughter's arm. They both heard it, Lucy's voice, identical in tone and inflection, calling from an empty room. They stood there, frozen, listening to the impossible. Whatever this was, it was learning them. It studied the way they spoke, the rhythms of their speech, the cadences of their fears and affections. It could sound like John Bell one moment, stern and commanding, and Lucy the next, warm and maternal, or it could sound like nothing human at all, a rasping hiss that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the ground beneath their feet, from the very air they breathed, a voice that bypassed your ears and spoke directly into your mind. The entity had patience. It didn't rush. It escalated slowly, methodically, like a musician building toward a crescendo. Each night brought something new, something slightly worse than the night before. A cold spot in the house that wouldn't warm no matter how much wood they fed the fire. The smell of sulfur appearing and disappearing randomly. Shadows moving against the light, defying physics, sliding across walls in directions that made no sense. One night, Betsy woke to the sensation of hands gripping her throat. She couldn't scream, couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Her body was paralyzed, locked in place by something she couldn't see or fight. Her brothers heard the choking sounds, the desperate gasping, and ran to her room, only to find her alone, convulsing on the bed, clawing at her own neck, trying to pry away fingers that weren't there. John Bell stood in the doorway, holding a lantern, and for the first time in his life, he had no explanation. He'd built this house with his own hands, driven every nail, set every beam. He'd blessed it, prayed over it, filled it with love and hard work and faith. And now something else lived here too. Something that had no respect for his labor, his prayers, or his authority. The attacks continued throughout the winter of 1817. They came in waves, intense periods of activity followed by brief respites, just long enough for the family to catch their breath and wonder if it was over, before starting again with renewed fury. The entity seemed to be testing them, measuring their resilience, learning what frightened them most and then exploiting those fears with surgical precision. And the worst part, the part that kept them all awake even when the house was quiet, was the growing realization that this wasn't random. This wasn't some residual haunting, some echo of past tragedy replaying mindlessly. This was intelligent. This was deliberate. Whatever was in their house was thinking, planning, and enjoying itself. Whatever it wasn't passing through. It was settling in. And it had only just begun. The entity didn't stay silent for long. After weeks of scratching, knocking, and phantom hands, it found its voice, and when it spoke, everyone heard it. It wasn't a whisper or a distant echo. It was clear, sharp, and unmistakably present, a woman's voice, low and mocking, with a cadence that felt both ancient and disturbingly familiar, like a half-remembered song from childhood twisted into something sinister. The first time it spoke directly to the family, they were gathered for evening prayer. This was February 1818, nearly 4 months into the haunting. John Bell was reading from Scripture, his voice steady despite the exhaustion evident in his face, when the voice interrupted him mid-sentence. "You can stop pretending, John. I'm already here." The room went cold. Not the gradual chill of winter seeping through cracks, but an instantaneous drop in temperature, as if all the warmth had been sucked out of the air in a single breath. The candles flickered but didn't go out, as if the presence wanted them to see each other's fear, wanted to watch their faces as reality shifted beneath their feet. Lucy clutched her Bible so hard her knuckles went white. The children froze, some of them starting to cry silently, tears streaming down their faces without sound. And John Bell, a man who'd never been accused of cowardice, who'd faced down armed men and dangerous animals without flinching, felt his hands tremble against the pages of Scripture. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the terror crawling up his spine like ice water. The voice laughed, a sound like dry leaves scraping across stone, like wind through a graveyard, like something that had forgotten how human laughter was supposed to sound and was doing its best impression. "I'm Kate. Kate Batts. You know me, John. Or you should. Kate Batts." The name hit John like a physical blow. Kate Batts was a neighbor, a woman John had done business with years ago, a contentious land deal that had ended in bad blood and public accusations. She'd cursed him publicly, standing in the churchyard after services one Sunday, pointing a gnarled finger at him and calling him a cheat and a liar in front of half the congregation. Most people dismissed her as unstable, prone to fits and strange proclamations, the kind of woman who scared children and made men uncomfortable. She'd died a few years back, alone and bitter, in a cabin that smelled of herbs and decay. But this voice, this thing claiming to be her, had her cadence, her way of spitting consonants when she was angry, the particular rhythm of her contempt. "Kate Batts is dead," John said firmly, trying to reclaim some authority. "She's been dead for years." "Then call me what I am," the voice replied, and there was something almost playful in its tone now, as if it was enjoying the revelation. "Call me the Bell Witch. I like that better anyway." And so it became known. The Bell Witch. Not a ghost, not a demon, something in between, something that defied easy categorization. It had a personality, complex and contradictory. It had opinions on everything from Scripture to politics to the quality of Lucy's cooking. It had a sense of humor, cruel and cutting, and it loved an audience. The more people who came to witness it, the more animated it became. The witch would speak at length, engaging in conversations with the family, with visitors, with anyone brave or foolish enough to address it directly. It quoted Scripture better than the preacher, citing chapter and verse with perfect accuracy, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in Greek, languages no one in the household spoke. It would engage in theological debates, taking positions that were simultaneously orthodox and heretical, arguing with the kind of sophisticated reasoning that suggested centuries of study. It sang hymns in a voice so beautiful it made grown men weep, a soprano so pure and clear it seemed impossible that it could come from something malevolent. But then it would twist the lyrics into blasphemies mid-verse, turning "Amazing Grace" into a celebration of damnation, transforming prayers into curses, making the sacred profane with just a few changed words. The witch answered questions before they were asked, completing people's sentences, revealing their thoughts before they could voice them. It told John what he'd had for breakfast 3 days ago. It told Lucy about the letter she'd written but never sent. It told the children about games they'd played in secret, words they'd whispered when they thought no one was listening. It revealed secrets people had buried for years. It knew about the affair the neighbor was having. It knew about the money the merchant had stolen from the church collection. It knew about the child born out of wedlock and given away in secret. Nothing was hidden from it. No confidence was safe. No private moment was truly private. And it used this information like a weapon, not revealing everything at once, but dropping hints, making veiled references, creating paranoia and distrust. Neighbors who came to investigate left shaken, not just because they'd witnessed the supernatural, but because the witch knew them, knew their sins, their fears, the things they'd done in the dark when they thought God wasn't watching. People started avoiding each other, wondering who'd been talking, who'd betrayed whose confidence. Marriages became strained. Friendships dissolved. The community that had once been tight-knit began to fracture, everyone suspicious of everyone else, all because the bell witch was pulling strings with the skill of a master puppeteer. But here's the strange part, the part that made the bell witch different from every other haunting in American folklore: it could be kind. Not always, not consistently, but enough to create confusion, to prevent anyone from fully hating it. It would comfort Lucy when she cried, speaking to her in a soothing tone that was almost motherly, calling her "Dear Lucy" and promising that everything would be all right, that this wouldn't last forever, that she just needed to be patient. And Lucy, desperate for any kindness in the nightmare her life had become, found herself responding, found herself almost grateful for the comfort, even though she knew the source. The witch sang lullabies to the younger children, and they'd fall asleep peacefully, lulled by a voice that moments earlier had been screaming profanities. It gave gifts, small trinkets appearing out of nowhere, a ribbon for Betsy, perfectly tied in her favorite color, a carved wooden horse for Joel that was more finely crafted than anything available in Robertson County. The witch wanted them to love it, or at least to stop fighting it. It wanted to be part of the family, to be accepted, acknowledged, embraced. And in their exhaustion, in their desperation for peace, some of them almost considered it. But the witch had rules, unspoken but absolute, and breaking them came with consequences. It demanded respect. It demanded attention. It demanded to be taken seriously, not dismissed or ignored. And above all, it demanded one thing: the suffering of John Bell. Because while the witch could be kind to Lucy, gentle with the children, even cordial with visitors, it hated John Bell with a passion that bordered on obsession. It said so, repeatedly, in language so vile that even hardened frontiersmen blushed and made excuses to leave. It called him a fraud, a thief, a man who smiled to your face while plotting how to steal from your pocket. It blamed him for everything, for its suffering, for its rage, for the fact that it was trapped between worlds with nothing but this family to torment. And it promised, over and over, in dozens of variations, that it would kill him. "I'll torment you, John Bell, for as long as you live," it said one night, its voice dripping with venom and something else, something that might have been grief or longing or both. "I'll make every day a misery. I'll poison your food, strangle you in your sleep, drive you to madness. And when you finally die, when your heart gives out from fear and guilt and exhaustion, I'll dance on your grave and sing hymns of celebration." The family realized then that this wasn't random. This wasn't about the house or the land or even Kate Batts, really. This was personal. This was about John Bell specifically, about something he'd done, some sin he'd committed, some debt he owed that the witch had come to collect. And the bell witch wasn't going anywhere until it got what it wanted. Until John Bell paid in full. The Bells tried to leave. Of course they did. When your home becomes a prison and the walls start talking back with more intelligence than most of your neighbors, when your daughter is being choked by invisible hands and your livestock are dying mysteriously and your reputation in the community is disintegrating, you pack what you can and you go. You start over somewhere else. You cut your losses. But the Bell Witch had other plans. The first attempt happened in early 1818, around March, when the winter was breaking and the roads were barely passable. John Bell decided they'd visit relatives in North Carolina, just for a few weeks, long enough to clear their heads and figure out what to do. Maybe the witch was tied to the land, he thought. Maybe if they left the property, it couldn't follow. It was wishful thinking, but wishful thinking was all they had left. They loaded the wagon, gathered the children, packed food and supplies for the journey. Lucy said goodbye to the house like she might never see it again, touching the walls she'd lived with for 14 years, hoping desperately that she wouldn't have to come back. They set out just after dawn, 6 of them in the wagon, moving at a steady pace down the road that led east toward North Carolina. They made it exactly 3 miles. 3 miles down the road, with the Bell farm still visible behind them if you turned around, the horses stopped. Not spooked, not tired, just stopped. They planted their feet and refused to move, their muscles locked, their eyes wide with fear but their bodies absolutely still. John snapped the reins, shouted commands, even climbed down to check their legs for injury or obstruction. The animals were fine physically, but they stood frozen as if rooted to the spot, trembling but immobile. And then came the laughter. It echoed through the trees, sourceless and everywhere at once, surrounding them from all directions. The children started crying. Lucy grabbed the youngest and held them close. And John Bell stood there in the middle of the road, reins in his hands, feeling the last of his hope drain away. "Going somewhere, John?" the witch's voice asked, dripping with amusement. "I don't think so. We're not done yet. Not by a long shot." The horses bolted suddenly, not forward but backward, dragging the wagon in reverse all the way back to the farm. John fought with the reins, trying to turn them, trying to stop them, but they moved with supernatural strength, eyes rolling, foam at their mouths, dragging the entire family backward down the road they'd just traveled. When they crossed the property line, onto Bell land, the animals calmed immediately, as if nothing had happened. As if they'd just been on a pleasant morning ride. The family sat in the wagon, breathing hard, staring at the house they'd tried to escape. And they knew. They knew with absolute certainty that they were trapped. That wherever they went, however far they ran, the witch would follow. Or worse, it would stop them. Keep them here. Make them stay and face whatever it had planned. They never tried to leave again. But the witch wasn't satisfied with just keeping them there. It wanted to remind them, constantly, that they existed at its mercy, that their lives were no longer their own. Doors would lock from the inside, trapping family members in rooms for hours. Betsy got locked in the cellar once, in complete darkness, for an entire afternoon. They could hear her screaming, pounding on the door, but when John tried to break it down, the wood wouldn't splinter, wouldn't even crack. The door was made of ordinary pine, but it might as well have been steel. When the witch finally let her out, hours later, Betsy was hoarse from screaming and covered in scratches from clawing at the walls in the dark. Food would spoil overnight, meat turning rancid, milk curdling in the pail, vegetables rotting in their sacks, all within hours, as if weeks had passed. They'd go to bed with a full larder and wake to find everything inedible, covered in mold and writhing with maggots. It happened multiple times. They started keeping less food in the house, buying smaller quantities more frequently, but the witch found ways to make even that difficult. The well water turned foul, tasting of sulfur and rot, smelling like something had died in it. John climbed down to check, nearly killing himself in the process, but the well was clean. The water was clear. There was no contamination. But when they brought it up and tried to drink it, it tasted like poison. They had to haul water from a neighbor's property, a mile away, every single day, and even then the witch would sometimes spoil it before they could get it home. Visitors to the farm had their own nightmares. Word had spread by now, and people came from all over Robertson County and beyond, some to help, some out of curiosity, some to test their courage against the supernatural. Almost none of them lasted a full night. James Johnston, a neighbor and friend, came to check on the family and offered to spend the night to witness the phenomenon firsthand. He was a practical man, a veteran of Indian conflicts, not easily frightened. He later told people it was the worst mistake of his life. He'd barely closed his eyes when something yanked the blanket off his bed. He grabbed it back, determined not to show fear, and a tug-of-war ensued. But there was nothing on the other end. Just empty air. Empty air with the strength of a bull. The blanket was being pulled so hard it made a tearing sound, and James could see it stretching, see the fabric distorting, but he couldn't see what was pulling it. When he finally gave up, exhausted, the blanket flew across the room and slapped him in the face, hard enough to leave a mark. Then the witch spoke, right in his ear, close enough that he could feel breath that wasn't there. "You should have stayed home, James. This isn't your fight." He was gone before sunrise and refused to ever speak of it in detail again. When people pressed him, asked him what really happened, he'd just shake his head and say, "Whatever the bells say happened, it's worse than that. I promise you." But the attacks on Betsy Bell were the worst. The witch seemed obsessed with her, following her everywhere, speaking to her constantly, sometimes sweetly, sometimes with venom. It had been targeting her since the beginning, but now the intensity increased. The witch would slap her across the face in front of witnesses, the sound of the impact echoing through the room, leaving red marks that lasted for days. Handprints. Perfect, distinct handprints, as if someone had gripped her face and squeezed. It pulled her hair so hard she screamed, yanking entire strands out by the roots. She'd wake up with clumps of hair on her pillow, her scalp bleeding in places. It would choke her in her sleep, and her brothers would find her gasping, clawing at invisible hands, her face turning purple from lack of oxygen. The family tried everything to protect her. They moved her to different rooms, thinking maybe the witch was tied to a particular space. They had her sleep surrounded by siblings, thinking safety in numbers might help. They even brought in the preacher to bless her bed, to sprinkle holy water, to recite prayers of protection. Nothing worked. The witch would laugh and say, "You can't keep me away from her. She's mine. She's always been mine." Betsy, to her credit, fought back. She wasn't passive. She'd shout at the witch, curse it, demand it leave her alone. She'd stand in the middle of her room, fists clenched, and scream, "Get out. You don't belong here. Leave me alone." Sometimes it would go quiet for a few hours, as if considering her defiance, maybe even respecting it. But it always came back, angrier, crueler, more determined. And Betsy began to break. People began to whisper that Betsy had done something to deserve this, that maybe she'd invited it somehow, made a pact or committed some sin. Young women were always suspect in cases like this. There were whispers of witchcraft, of Betsy herself being in league with dark forces. The rumors were as painful as the physical attacks, maybe more so. She became isolated, even among her own family, because being near her meant being near the witch, and no one wanted that. People would step back when she entered a room. Friends stopped visiting. Young men who might have courted her suddenly found excuses to be elsewhere. Betsy felt like a plague carrier, contaminating everyone she touched. The witch seemed to feed on their fear, growing louder, bolder, more physical with each passing week. It would throw objects across rooms, slam doors so hard the hinges broke and had to be replaced multiple times. It shattered glass just to watch the family flinch, just to see them cut their feet on shards they couldn't avoid. It wasn't haunting the house anymore. If it had ever been about the house, that time was long past. This was about the family. This was about breaking them. This was about making them understand, viscerally, that they had no control, no agency, no power to change their circumstances. The witch had won. It had trapped them completely. And it made absolutely sure they knew the difference between a ghost and a prison guard. Word spread fast. In a community where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than any horse, you couldn't keep something like the Bell Witch quiet. At first, people were skeptical. Frontier life was hard enough without inventing ghost stories, but then the visitors started coming. Neighbors, preachers, even men of science, and they all left believers. What made the Bell Witch different from other ghost stories was the sheer volume of credible witnesses. This wasn't a story told second-hand or third-hand, embellished over generations until the truth was impossible to extract. This was witnessed in real time by dozens of people, many of whom wrote down their experiences, signed their names, and staked their reputations on the truth of what they'd seen. Reverend James Gunn from the Red River Baptist Church came to investigate in the spring of 1818. He was a stern man, educated in theology, not given to superstition or flights of fancy. He told the bells plainly that he believed they were either lying or mistaken, that there was surely a rational explanation for the disturbances. Perhaps shared delusion brought on by stress. Perhaps a prankster in the community. Perhaps simple misunderstanding of natural phenomena. He agreed to spend the night to prove it. To demonstrate that there was nothing supernatural happening, just ordinary events misinterpreted by frightened people. He didn't make it past midnight. The witch waited until he was settled in the guest room, Bible open on his lap, reading by candlelight. It let him get comfortable. It let him start to relax, to think maybe the bells had exaggerated their troubles. And then it spoke. "Hello, Reverend. Let's talk about your sermon last Sunday. The one about humility. You really should take your own advice." Reverend Gunn went pale. He looked around the empty room, seeing nothing, but hearing that voice clear as day, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Who's there?" he demanded, trying to sound authoritative. "Someone who knows you better than your congregation does," the witch replied. And then it proceeded to recount, in excruciating detail, every sin the good reverend had committed in the past decade. The money he'd borrowed and never repaid. The way he'd coveted his neighbor's wife. The lies he'd told to protect his reputation. Things he'd never confessed to anyone, things he thought he'd buried so deep that even God might have overlooked them. By the time it was done, Reverend Gunn was on his knees, praying desperately, tears streaming down his face, begging for forgiveness from a presence he couldn't see or comprehend. The witch laughed and said, "Don't worry, James. I won't tell anyone. You will." He left at dawn, shaken and gray-faced, and never spoke publicly about that night again. But he never doubted the bells either. When people asked him if the haunting was real, he'd just nod slowly and say, "It's real. God help them, it's real." Dr. George Hobson, a physician and a man of reason, came armed with medical explanations. He was part of a new generation of practitioners who believed in science, in observable phenomena, in rational causes for every effect. Hysteria, he said. Mass delusion. Shared psychosis brought on by prolonged stress and isolation. He'd seen it before in other families, particularly those living on the frontier with limited social contact. He examined Betsy, checking her for signs of self-harm, for evidence that she might be creating the marks herself unconsciously. He checked the house for structural issues, for drafts or settling that might cause strange sounds. He interviewed the family members separately, looking for inconsistencies in their stories that would suggest fabrication. He concluded there was a rational explanation for everything. It was all in their minds. Then the witch pulled his chair out from under him mid-sentence, sending him crashing to the floor, his medical bag spilling open, instruments scattering across the room. "Mass delusion, doctor?" the witch asked, mimicking his voice perfectly, every inflection, every precise pronunciation he'd used moments before. "Or maybe you just don't know what you're looking at. Maybe your precious science has limits, and you're too arrogant to admit it." Dr. Hobson scrambled to his feet, gathering his instruments with shaking hands. He left without finishing his examination, muttering about things science couldn't explain yet, adding that qualifier, that yet, as if given enough time and research, this too would yield to rational analysis. But everyone who saw his face knew he didn't believe it. He'd encountered something that broke his understanding of how the world worked, and he didn't have the framework to process it. But the most famous visitor, according to legend and depending on which historical sources you trust, was General Andrew Jackson, future President of the United States and already a hero of the War of 1812. Jackson was known as Old Hickory, a man of iron will and fierce courage. He'd fought Native American warriors, British regulars, and political enemies with equal determination. He was not a man who scared easily. Jackson had heard the stories and reportedly said, "I'd rather fight the British again than deal with the Bell Witch." But curiosity got the better of him. He and a group of men, including some who'd served under him in battle, traveled to the Bell farm in a wagon loaded with supplies, ready to spend several days investigating and possibly debunking the phenomenon. They never made it onto the property. The wagon stopped at the edge of the Bell land, right at the property line, wheels locked, horses refusing to move. Jackson's men tried everything. They whipped the horses, which they hated doing, but desperation drove them to it. They pushed the wagon from behind, all 6 grown men straining against it. They even unloaded it completely to reduce the weight, thinking maybe the springs had jammed or the axle had locked. Nothing worked. The wagon sat there as if rooted to the ground, immovable as a mountain. Jackson himself climbed down and examined the wheels, checked the axle, looked for any mechanical explanation. He found none. The wagon was fine. There was no reason it shouldn't move. But it wouldn't budge an inch. Then they heard it. A woman's voice, clear as day, tinged with amusement. "All right, General. I've had my fun. Let the wagon move. I'll talk to you tonight." The wheels turned instantly, the horses stepped forward, and the wagon rolled onto the Bell property as if nothing had happened, as if the previous 20 minutes of struggle had been imaginary. Jackson reportedly went pale, which for a man of his reputation was saying something. "Boys," he said quietly to his men, "I've faced down armies, and I'd rather do that any day than spend a night here." According to the stories passed down, Jackson and his men did spend that night at the Bell farm, and the witch tormented them relentlessly. It pulled blankets off their beds. It threw their boots across the room. It made strange noises that kept them from sleeping. And it slapped one particularly skeptical soldier, a man who'd been loudly declaring the whole thing a fraud, so hard across the face that he bled, and when he looked in a mirror the next morning, you could see distinct fingerprints bruised into his cheek. By morning, Jackson and his group were packed and ready to leave, and the general allegedly said, "I'd rather fight the entire British army for a second time than deal with that damned Bell witch again." Whether or not Jackson actually visited is debated by historians. Some say it's documented in journals and letters. Others say it's apocryphal, a legend that grew around a legend. But the fact that the story exists at all, that Andrew Jackson's name became attached to this haunting, speaks to the witch's reputation. This wasn't some backwoods superstition that stayed local. This was something witnessed, documented, and feared by educated, respected, powerful people. Judge James Blackmore came from a neighboring county, curious about the legal implications. Could a supernatural entity be tried for assault? Could it be held responsible for property damage? These were questions no one had answers to, but Blackmore wanted to investigate. He spent 3 nights at the Bell farm, taking careful notes, observing with the detached professionalism of a jurist examining evidence. On the 3rd night, the witch addressed him directly. "Judge Blackmore. I know about the case from 1813. The one you threw out because the defendant paid you. The widow who lost everything because you took a bribe." Blackmore stood up so fast he knocked over his chair. "That's a lie," he said, but his voice shook. "Is it?" the witch asked. "Then why are you shaking? Why is your heart racing? Why are you already planning your departure?" He left within the hour and never spoke of the Bell witch again, at least not publicly. But he also never returned to that part of Tennessee, taking cases in counties far from Robertson, as if distance might protect him from further revelation. Professor William Porter, a teacher and student of folklore, came from Nashville with every intention of documenting a folk phenomenon and explaining it through the lens of cultural psychology. He believed in the power of collective belief to create experiences that felt real to participants. He thought the Bell witch was a shared delusion, a community-wide performance where everyone had unconsciously agreed to play their parts. He spent a week at the farm, interviewing family members, taking measurements, checking for tricks or stagecraft. And for the first few days, nothing happened. The house was quiet. The witch didn't speak. Professor Porter began to write his paper, titled The Bell Witch, A Study in Collective Hysteria. On his last night, the witch came to him. It started with laughter, soft at first, then building to a roar that filled the entire house. Then it spoke. "Professor Porter. You think you understand, but you don't. You can't. Because understanding requires humility, and you have none." It proceeded to demonstrate knowledge that no one in the Bell family could have possessed. It told Porter about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about the death of his younger sister, about the guilt he carried for surviving when she didn't. It told him about his unpublished research, the work he'd hidden because it contradicted his public positions. It told him secrets he'd never shared with anyone. When it was done, Professor Porter sat in silence for a long time. Then he gathered his papers, walked to the fireplace, and burned them all. He left the next morning without saying goodbye, and when he returned to Nashville, he never published his findings. He told colleagues only that he'd been wrong, that there were things in this world that couldn't be explained, and that some mysteries were better left unexamined. Every single person who came to the Bell farm with skepticism left with belief. Every person who came with confidence left with doubt. Every person who came thinking they could explain or control or understand the Bell Witch left knowing they'd encountered something that operated outside the boundaries of their understanding. They came to debunk it. They left running. And their testimonies, dozens of them, signed and dated and documented, form the historical basis for why the Bell Witch remains one of the most credible supernatural events in American history. The Bells didn't give up. They couldn't. This was their home, their land, their life, the result of years of backbreaking work and sacrifice. They'd be damned if some invisible tormentor was going to drive them out without a fight. So they fought back, not with weapons or physical strength, because how do you fight something you can't see or touch, but with faith, defiance, and sheer stubborn will. Lucy Bell led the charge. She was a woman of deep, unshakable faith, the kind forged in the hardship of frontier life where God was often all you had between yourself and oblivion. If the devil himself had taken up residence in her home, she'd cast him out with prayer, with scripture, with the force of her belief. Every morning, she gathered the family for scripture reading, no matter how tired they were, no matter how little sleep they'd gotten. Every night, they prayed together, hands clasped, voices rising in unison, reciting psalms and hymns and entreaties for divine intervention. The witch would interrupt, of course, mocking their words, twisting their prayers into curses, turning sacred phrases into blasphemies. But Lucy refused to stop. "You will not have this family," she said aloud one night, staring at the empty air where she felt the presence strongest. "We belong to God, and you have no power here. No real power. You're just noise and spite." The witch laughed, that dry scraping sound that made everyone's skin crawl. "We'll see about that, dear Lucy. We'll see how long your faith holds when your husband is dead and your daughter is broken." But there were cracks in its confidence. When the family prayed in unison, really committed to it, pouring their fear and hope and desperation into those words, the witch would go quiet. Not silent, never fully silent, but subdued, as if the words themselves had weight, as if faith, genuine faith, created a kind of pressure it couldn't withstand. It hated the hymns most of all. When the bells sang together, particularly the old ones, Amazing Grace, and Rock of Ages, and How Great Thou Art, the witch would scream, a high-pitched wail that made the windows rattle and the dogs howl outside. And sometimes, just sometimes, it would retreat for a few hours, giving them blessed silence, blessed peace, before returning with renewed fury. John Bell tried a different approach. If the witch wanted a fight, if it fed on fear and submission, then he'd give it defiance. He started talking back, not with fear or pleading, but with anger, with the righteous fury of a man defending his family. "You think you can break me?" he shouted one night, standing in the middle of the main room, family gathered around him. "You're nothing but a coward, hiding in the shadows, picking on a family that can't fight back. If you're so powerful, show yourself. Face me like you have the courage you claim." The witch materialized, not as a body, not as something visible, but as a presence, a cold, oppressive weight that filled the room and made it hard to breathe, as if the air had become thick, resistant. The temperature dropped so fast frost formed on the inside of the windows. Everyone felt it pressing down on them, squeezing, suffocating. "Be careful what you wish for, John," it said softly, and there was genuine menace in its voice now, the playfulness gone. "I've been holding back. I've been gentle. But I can be so much worse." But John didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. His family was watching, and if he broke, if he showed weakness, they'd all break with him. "Do your worst," he said through gritted teeth. "I'm not afraid of you." It was a lie, and they both knew it. John Bell was terrified, had been terrified for months, barely sleeping, losing weight, his health deteriorating under the constant stress. But it was a lie he committed to, standing tall, meeting the invisible presence with every ounce of courage he could muster. And for a moment, just a moment, it worked. The witch didn't kill him that night. The pressure lifted. The temperature slowly returned to normal. Maybe it respected the defiance. Maybe it enjoyed the challenge. Or maybe it just wanted to savor the slow destruction, to let John think he had a chance before crushing him completely. The children tried their own methods. Richard and Joel, the older boys, attempted to catch the witch in the act. They'd stay up all night in shifts, watching, waiting, armed with whatever they could find, sticks, knives, even a Bible clutched like a weapon, as if the physical book itself might have protective power. They never saw anything. But they felt it. Cold air moving past them like something walking through the room. Breath on the backs of their necks, moist and warm, despite no one being there. Laughter echoing in the dark, coming from multiple directions at once, as if they were surrounded. One night, Richard tried to trap it. He'd heard stories about spirits being unable to cross salt lines or iron, old folk beliefs that might have some truth. He created a circle of salt around Betsy's bed, thinking maybe he could protect her, create a barrier the witch couldn't penetrate. The witch laughed so hard the whole house shook. "Oh, Richard. Sweet, stupid Richard. You think salt frightens me? You think I'm bound by your folk magic and your grandmother's superstitions?" The salt exploded outward, scattering across the room as if blown by a powerful wind, even though the windows were closed and the air was still. And then Betsy felt the familiar hands around her throat, tighter than before, angrier, and Richard could only watch helplessly as his sister struggled, as his attempt to protect her made things worse. Betsy tried something desperate, something that took more courage than anything else she'd done. She spoke to the witch directly, not with anger, not with fear, but with sadness, with genuine emotion, appealing to whatever humanity might remain in it. "Why me?" she asked one night, alone in her room, voice trembling. "What did I do to you? I've never hurt anyone. I've never wished harm on anyone. Why are you doing this?" The witch's response was almost gentle, almost kind, which somehow made it worse. "You didn't do anything, Betsy. You're innocent. That's the point. You're just caught in the middle of something between your father and me. Then let me go," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please. I can't live like this anymore. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I'm afraid all the time. If you have any mercy, any kindness, please just let me go." There was a long silence, so long that Betsy thought maybe it was gone, maybe it had finally listened. Then the witch spoke again, and the tenderness was gone, replaced by cold finality. "I can't. Not yet. Not until it's done. Not until your father pays for what he did." "Until what's done?" Betsy asked desperately. "What did he do? Tell me and maybe we can fix it. Maybe we can make it right." But the witch didn't answer. It never gave them that satisfaction, never revealed its full purpose, keeping them in the dark, letting them twist in uncertainty and fear. The family also tried bargaining. They offered the witch anything, money, which they didn't have much of but would give every penny, land, they'd sign over parcels if it would leave, livestock, take the animals, take the crops, take everything of value they owned. Anything to make it leave. The witch didn't want their possessions. I'm not here for your things, John Bell. I'm here for your soul. For your suffering. For your understanding of what it means to be helpless and afraid. They consulted healers, the few who still practiced the old ways, mixing Christianity with folk magic and Native American traditions. A woman named Sarah came from 3 counties over, carrying bags of herbs and carved stones. She walked the property, burying charms at the 4 corners, hanging talismans over doorways, creating protective circles with ash and bone. The witch watched with what sounded like amusement. When Sarah was done, when she'd performed all her rituals and spoken all her incantations, the witch spoke. That was entertaining, Sarah. But you're no match for me. Go home. Your magic is old and weak, and I am neither. Sarah left quickly, refusing payment, saying only, "May God have mercy on you all." Others tried exorcisms. 3 different preachers came, each with their own methods, their own prayers, their own absolute certainty that the power of Christ would drive out any demon. They recited scripture, sprinkled holy water, called upon angels and saints, commanded the entity to depart in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The witch laughed through all of it. You think I'm afraid of your prayers? I know those words better than you do. I could recite scripture for hours. Your God and I are well acquainted. Nothing worked. If anything, the witch seemed amused by their efforts, like a cat watching a mouse try to escape, entertained by the struggle but never in danger of losing control. But the family didn't stop. They couldn't. Because stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant letting the witch win, meant accepting that they had no agency, no power, no hope. So they prayed, they fought, they bargained, they endured. Day after day, month after month, they held on. And slowly, painfully, they began to realize something: the witch wasn't just tormenting them randomly. It wasn't chaos. It was building toward something. It had a purpose, a goal, a specific outcome it was engineering. It was waiting for something to happen, or making something happen, shaping events with patient, deliberate intent. Until they figured out what that was, the nightmare wouldn't end. And figuring it out might be the most terrifying discovery of all. The truth came slowly, piece by piece, revealed through the witch's taunts, through old rumors resurrected, through secrets the Bell family had buried so deep they'd almost convinced themselves they weren't real. It's one thing to be haunted by evil. It's another thing entirely to be haunted by guilt, by the consequences of your own actions returned to destroy you. It started with Kate Batts. Remember her? The neighbor who'd cursed John Bell years earlier, the one whose name the witch had initially claimed as its own. The land deal between them had been contentious, bitter even, one of those disputes that small communities remember for generations. Here's what happened. Kate Batts' husband died in 1809, leaving her with land but little money. She was desperate, vulnerable, trying to hold on to what her husband had built while raising children alone in a place where widows had few options and fewer rights. John Bell approached her about purchasing a portion of the land, prime acreage that bordered his own property. The sale went through. The papers were signed. Money changed hands. But Kate believed, until the day she died, that she'd been cheated, that John had taken advantage of her desperation, had paid far less than the land was worth, and had then profited greatly from it. She'd called him a thief publicly, shouted it in the churchyard, in the market, anywhere people would listen. John Bell stole from me. He smiled to my face and robbed my children's inheritance. Most folks dismissed her as unhinged, a woman driven mad by grief and poverty, her accusations the ravings of someone who couldn't accept her circumstances. But her words haunted John Bell. He'd never admitted wrongdoing, not publicly, not even privately to Lucy. But late at night, in the quiet moments when a man's conscience speaks loudest, he wondered. Had he been fair? Or had he, in his ambition to expand his holdings, taken advantage of someone vulnerable? Had he paid what the land was truly worth, or what he could get away with? The witch knew. Of course it knew. It had been there, somehow, watching, listening, absorbing every moment of guilt John tried to suppress, every rationalization, every attempt to convince himself he'd done nothing wrong. "You stole from her, John," the witch said one night, its voice calm, almost conversational, which was somehow more unsettling than when it screamed. "You knew the land was worth more. You knew she needed the money. You knew she had no leverage, no options, no husband to negotiate for her. And you took advantage. You saw an opportunity and you took it, all while calling yourself a Christian, a man of God." "I paid a fair price," John insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. The words came out automatically, a defense he'd repeated so many times it had become reflex, but even he didn't fully believe it anymore. "You paid what you could get away with," the witch corrected. "There's a difference. And Kate died cursing your name, promising that you'd pay, that your family would pay, that this land would never give you peace. She died believing her children had been robbed of their birthright because of you. But it went deeper than that. The witch wasn't just Kate Batts. It had said so itself, multiple times. Kate's rage, her grief, her sense of injustice, these had created an opening, but the entity itself was something older, something that had latched onto those emotions and used them as an anchor, a doorway into the world. Some believed it was a witch who'd lived on the land centuries before, a woman executed for her crimes during the darker times when such things happened regularly, her spirit bound to the earth, unable to move on. Others thought it was a Native American curse, vengeance for land stolen long before the Bells ever arrived, part of a larger pattern of displacement and violence that had soaked the Tennessee earth in blood and broken promises. A few whispered, in quiet moments when they thought no one was listening, that it was something the Bells themselves had created, that John's guilt and Lucy's fear and Betsy's innocence had somehow combined to give birth to this entity, a manifestation of their own darkness made real through some mechanism no one understood. The witch never confirmed any of it. It seemed to enjoy the mystery, the speculation, the way people twisted themselves into knots trying to understand. But it did reveal one thing, clearly and repeatedly: it had chosen the Bells specifically, deliberately, with full knowledge of who they were and what they'd done. "There are plenty of sinners in Tennessee," it said one night, speaking to the whole family gathered in the main room. "Plenty of men who've cheated and lied and stolen. Plenty of men worse than you, John Bell. Men who've killed, who've raped, who've committed atrocities you can't even imagine. But you pretended to be righteous. You stood in church every Sunday, prayed with your family, sang hymns, acted like a pillar of the community, a man of God, all while knowing what you'd done. That hypocrisy, that smug self-satisfaction, that absolute certainty that you were a good man despite your actions, that's what drew me to you. You needed to be humbled. You needed to understand what it feels like to be helpless, to be at someone else's mercy, to have your life destroyed by forces you can't control. And so the haunting wasn't random. It wasn't a ghost story, wasn't just supernatural phenomena without purpose. It was justice, or at least the witch's twisted version of it. It had come to punish John Bell specifically, to strip away his reputation, his peace, his health, his sense of control, and ultimately, his life. But why Betsy? This was the question that tormented the family more than anything else. Why torment an innocent girl? Why make her suffer for her father's sins? It wasn't fair. It wasn't just. If the witch wanted revenge, it should take it on John directly, not through his children. The witch's answer, when it finally came, was chilling in its logic. Because pain is a teacher, John Bell, and you needed to learn. I could hurt you directly. I could choke you in your sleep, poison your food, break your bones. But that wouldn't teach you anything. That would just be suffering without understanding. But watching your daughter suffer, watching Betsy cry and scream and beg for mercy, knowing you're the cause, knowing your actions brought this to her door, knowing there's nothing you can do to protect her, that's a punishment no amount of prayer can heal. That's the kind of pain that breaks a man from the inside out. Betsy, sitting there listening, felt something crack inside her. All this time, all these months of terror and pain and isolation, and it was because of her father. Because of a business deal she knew nothing about, a transaction that happened when she was a child. She was collateral damage in someone else's sin. She looked at her father and saw him differently now. Not as the strong, protective figure she'd admired all her life, but as a flawed, broken man whose mistakes had cursed his entire family. And despite everything, despite her anger and her pain and her resentment, she couldn't bring herself to hate him. Because she saw what the witch was doing to him, saw how he was deteriorating, saw the guilt literally consuming him from the inside out. "I'm sorry," John said quietly, looking at Betsy with tears in his eyes. "God help me, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. All of it." The revelation broke something in John Bell. Whatever resistance he'd maintained, whatever stubborn will had kept him fighting, it crumbled. He stopped arguing with the witch. He stopped trying to defend himself. He accepted, with a grim finality, that the witch had won, that judgment had been passed and sentence was being carried out. He withdrew into himself, growing weaker, sicker, as if the weight of his guilt was literally crushing him. The doctor could find nothing physically wrong, no disease, no injury, but John was clearly dying. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He spent hours sitting in his chair, staring at nothing, lost in thoughts no one could reach. Lucy tried to comfort him, but he was beyond comfort. "It's my fault," he'd say over and over. "I brought this on us. On you, on the children, on Betsy. I did this." And the witch would whisper agreements in the dark, confirming his worst thoughts, reinforcing his guilt, driving him deeper into despair. "Yes, John. Yes, you did. And now you're paying. Finally, after all these years, you're paying." The witch wasn't born there, on that Tennessee farm. It wasn't some random spirit that happened to occupy that space. It was invited, called into being by greed, by guilt, by the simple human failing of taking more than you deserve and calling it business. John Bell had made a choice years ago, a choice that seemed small at the time, just another transaction, just another way to improve his position. But choices have consequences. And sometimes those consequences wait, building pressure like a dam holding back a flood, until finally the structure breaks and everything comes rushing through. The Bell family learned this the hardest way possible. And John Bell, who'd thought himself a good man, who'd believed his prayers and his reputation would protect him, discovered that guilt is patient, and justice, when it finally comes, doesn't care about your excuses. The end came in December 1820. 3 years after the haunting began, John Bell, once a strong, vital man who could work from sunrise to sunset without complaint, was now a shadow of himself. Bedridden, weak, barely able to speak, his body had deteriorated over months without any physical cause the doctors could identify. No disease, no injury, no medical explanation. Just a slow, steady decline, as if life itself was being drained from him. The witch, they all knew, was killing him. Deliberately. Methodically. Savoring every moment. On the morning of December 19, 1820, John Bell slipped into unconsciousness. The family gathered around his bed, all of them, children who'd grown up under this curse, a wife who'd watched her husband waste away, all holding his hands, praying, saying goodbye to a man who was already gone in every way except the final one. And then the witch spoke, louder and clearer than it ever had before, filling the entire house with its voice, making sure everyone heard, making sure there were witnesses. "It's done," it said, and there was something almost like satisfaction in its tone, almost like relief. "John Bell will not wake up. I've seen to that. He's finished." Lucy, tears streaming down her face, looked up at the empty air and asked the question that had been burning in her heart for years. Why? Why did it have to be this way? He made a mistake, yes, but did he deserve this? Did we deserve this? The witch's response was almost gentle, which made it worse somehow, more painful than anger would have been. Because some debts can only be paid in suffering, Lucy. Because justice isn't always fair. Because the world doesn't care about your intentions or your prayers. John took from Kate Batts when she had nothing, and now he's lost everything. That's balance. That's how the universe works. But she's dead, Lucy said desperately. Kate Batts has been dead for years. This doesn't bring her back. This doesn't fix what was done. No, the witch agreed. But it means he didn't get away with it. It means there are consequences. And that matters. John Bell died that day, December 19, 1820, never regaining consciousness. The family prepared his body according to custom, washed him, dressed him in his best clothes, built a coffin from oak. They held a funeral at the Red River Baptist Church, where John had worshipped every Sunday for 16 years, where he'd stood among the congregation as a respected member of the community. The funeral was well attended, but it was also strange. Uncomfortable. Everyone knew how John had died, knew about the witch, knew that this wasn't a natural death but something else, something that made them question everything they thought they understood about the world. They buried him in the family plot on their land, under a large oak tree. And at the burial, multiple witnesses later swore they heard singing. A woman's voice, beautiful and haunting, singing a hymn over his grave. The same hymns John had sung in church, but twisted somehow, mocking in their beauty. The bell which had kept its promise. It had tormented John Bell until his death, and now it was dancing, in its own way, celebrating its victory over his grave. But the witch wasn't done. Not completely. It stayed for a few more months, speaking to the family occasionally, mostly to Lucy. Its tone was different now, softer, almost apologetic, as if the main performance was over and it could drop the cruelty. "I never wanted to hurt you, Lucy," it said one night, just the two of them, the children asleep. "You were always kind. You never did anything wrong. This was never about you. Then why stay?" Lucy asked, exhausted beyond measure, beyond grief. "Why keep tormenting us? He's dead. You won. What more do you want?" "I'm not tormenting you now," the witch said quietly. "I'm just, here. Finishing things. Making sure you understand." "Understand what?" "That actions have consequences. That guilt is real. That the universe demands balance. Your husband learned that. Your family learned that. And maybe, if you tell this story, if you pass it down, others will learn it too." Betsy, who'd been pretending to sleep, spoke up. "Will you ever come back?" The witch was silent for a long moment, considering. Then it said something that would become legend, that would be passed down through generations, whispered in Tennessee for the next 200 years. "Yes. In 107 years, I'll return. In 1935. Tell your children, your grandchildren, pass the story down. I'll be back, and I'll have more to say. More to teach. Because humans never learn. You keep making the same mistakes, generation after generation. Someone will need reminding." With that, the activity stopped. The house went quiet. The knocking, the voices, the cold spots, the invisible hands, all of it vanished overnight as if it had never been there, as if the past 3 years had been a collective dream. The family waited nervously for weeks, expecting it to return, jumping at every noise, every draft, every shadow. But it didn't. The bell witch was gone. Life returned to something resembling normal, though normal was a relative term now. Lucy stayed on the farm, raised her remaining children, managed the land with help from her sons. She never remarried. She lived into her 70s and died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family, her faith somehow intact despite everything she'd endured. Betsy married a man named Richard Powell, had children, moved away from Robertson County. She spent the rest of her life trying to forget the years she'd spent as the witch's target, though she never fully succeeded. She suffered nightmares until her final days, waking up screaming, clawing at invisible hands, reliving traumas that never fully healed. Richard Bell, one of the older sons, refused to ever speak about the witch, even on his deathbed when family members pressed him for stories. He'd just shake his head and say, "Some things are better left in the past." He'd take the full weight of those memories to his grave, as if saying its name might summon it back. The younger children grew up, scattered across the country, carrying with them the stories of what they'd endured, stories that seemed impossible in the retelling but that they swore were true, every word. But the scars remained. The Bell family never fully recovered. There was always a shadow over them, a sense that they'd been marked by something that ordinary people never encountered. Other families avoided marrying into the Bell line for a generation, superstitious about inherited curses. The farm itself changed. Neighbors avoided it. They'd walk an extra mile rather than cross Bell property. Crops grew slower there, yields consistently lower than surrounding farms. Animals refused to graze on certain parts of the land, turning away even when hungry. Anyone who spent the night in the house reported strange dreams, whispers in the dark, the feeling of being watched by something that wasn't quite gone. The house stood for decades, slowly falling into disrepair. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to live there. Eventually it was torn down, but the land remained, and with it, the legend. People claimed to see lights moving through the woods at night, hear laughter echoing across the fields. Some said the witch never really left, that it just went quiet, waiting, watching, biding its time until the moment was right to return. In 1935, the year the witch had promised to come back, nothing happened. Or at least, nothing documented in newspapers or official records. But locals whispered that strange things occurred that year throughout Robertson County. Unexplained noises. Objects moving. Voices in the dark. Multiple families reported disturbances, though none as severe as what the Bells had endured. Maybe the witch came back and found no Bells left to torment, no direct descendants living on the old land. Maybe it looked around, saw that the world had changed beyond recognition, and decided to wait longer. Or maybe it did what it intended to do, subtle and unnoticed, teaching lessons in ways no one recognized. The Bell witch left, but not forever. That much seems certain. Because legends like this don't die. They don't fade away or get forgotten. They wait, patient as stone, for the right moment to remind us that the world is stranger and darker than we want to believe. The Bell witch might be gone, but it never really left. Even now, more than 200 years later, the legend persists, growing stronger with each generation, refusing to fade into comfortable folklore. The land where the Bell farm once stood is known as the Bell Witch Cave, a tourist attraction in Adams, Tennessee, where visitors come from all over the world to experience the place where it all happened. And many of them leave believing. The cave itself is a natural limestone formation that runs beneath what used to be Bell property. Local tradition says the witch used these caves, that you could hear her voice echoing through the tunnels even when the house was quiet. Whether that's true or just story embellishment doesn't seem to matter, because people report hearing voices inside the cave even today, whispers that seem to come from the walls themselves, words you can almost understand but not quite. They feel sudden drops in temperature, cold spots that make no sense in the heat of a Tennessee summer. The kind of cold that goes through your clothes and settles in your bones, the kind that feels intelligent, purposeful, like something is standing right next to you breathing frost into your face. Cameras malfunction. Modern digital cameras, phones, professional equipment, all of it stops working inside the cave for no reason anyone can explain. Batteries drain instantly, full charges dying in seconds. Electronics that work perfectly fine everywhere else just stop functioning when you cross a certain threshold into the cave system. Some visitors claim to feel hands pushing them, touching them, pulling at their clothes. Not violently, but persistently, as if something wants their attention, wants them to notice, wants them to know it's still there. Park rangers have stories, lots of them, stories they don't tell the tourists because it might scare people away but that they share among themselves in quiet moments. Equipment that works perfectly fine everywhere else breaks down near the cave. Tools disappear and reappear in different locations. Locks open themselves. Doors close when no one's near them. Animals refuse to go inside certain sections of the cave system. Dogs will stop at invisible boundaries, hackles raised, whining, pulling back on their leashes with desperate strength. Birds won't fly over certain parts of the property. Even insects seem to avoid specific areas, creating dead zones where nothing lives. And late at night, when the park is closed and the tourists are gone, when it's just the rangers doing their rounds, some of them swear they hear singing. A woman's voice, clear and beautiful, echoing through the darkness. The same hymns the bell witch sang 2 centuries ago, the same melodies that once filled a farmhouse with dread and wonder. Is it the bell witch? Or is it just the power of suggestion, the weight of history, the human need to believe in something beyond the mundane? Maybe it doesn't matter. Because the bell witch, real or not, has become immortal. It's transcended the boundaries of history and become something larger, something archetypal. It's been the subject of books, dozens of them, some scholarly and attempting historical accuracy, others sensationalized and adding elements that probably never happened. It's been featured in movies, documentaries, podcasts, YouTube videos. It's part of American folklore now, right alongside Sleepy Hollow and the Salem witch trials and every other story that defines how Americans understand the supernatural. But unlike those stories, which feel safely in the past, contained by history, the bell witch feels present. It feels alive. It feels like it's still out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment, the right family, the right circumstances to make itself known again. The question people keep asking isn't whether the bell witch existed. The evidence is too strong, the witnesses too credible, the documentation too extensive to dismiss it entirely. The question is whether it's done. Whether its work is finished. Whether the debt has been fully paid. Because if the stories are true, if the witch really did promise to return, if it really does appear every century or so to teach humanity lessons we refuse to learn, then it's out there somewhere. Watching. Listening. Looking for the next John Bell, the next family with secrets to uncover and debts to collect. Some legends are warnings. They teach us to be better, to avoid the mistakes of those who came before. Don't cheat the widow. Don't take advantage of the vulnerable. Don't pretend righteousness while committing sins you hope no one notices. The bell witch is that kind of legend. It reminds us that our actions have consequences, that guilt and greed and hypocrisy don't just disappear, they linger, they grow, they take root like weeds, and eventually, they come back to haunt us in ways we can't predict or control. But it's also more than that. It's a story about the things we can't explain, the spaces between reason and superstition, science and faith. It's a reminder that the world is stranger and darker than we like to admit, that despite all our technology and understanding, there are still things that exist beyond our comprehension. Things that operate by rules we don't understand, for purposes we can't fathom. The Bell family endured something most of us can't even imagine. 3 years of unrelenting psychological and physical torment from an entity that seemed to know them better than they knew themselves. And they did it with courage, with faith, and with the stubborn refusal to let fear destroy them completely. They survived the Bell witch, even if they never fully escaped it, even if the scars lasted the rest of their lives. And maybe that's the real lesson buried in this story. You don't have to defeat the darkness to survive it. You don't have to understand evil to endure it. You just have to keep going, day after day, prayer after prayer, one moment of courage at a time, until either the darkness leaves or you learn to live with it always present in the corner of your vision. The Bell witch reminds us that we're not always in control. That there are forces in this world, or beyond it, that don't care about our plans, our beliefs, our sense of justice. That sometimes terrible things happen to people who don't fully deserve them, and the universe doesn't apologize or explain. So the next time you hear a noise in the night, a voice that shouldn't be there, a presence you can't quite explain, remember the bells. Remember what they faced in that Tennessee farmhouse over 200 years ago. Remember that they survived, even if survival looked different than they'd hoped. And ask yourself, honestly, in the dark quiet places of your mind where truth lives, would you be strong enough to survive the Bell Witch? Would you maintain your faith when prayers seemed to accomplish nothing? Would you protect your family when you couldn't see or fight the threat? Would you face your own guilt when it came back wearing a voice that knew all your secrets? Or would you run, like so many others did, leaving everything behind just to escape the sound of her laughter echoing through empty rooms, the feeling of invisible hands around your throat, the knowledge that something is watching you that you can never see, never understand, never fully escape? Because she's still out there. The Bell Witch. Whatever she is, whatever she was, whatever she will be when she returns. Still waiting. Still watching. Still listening for the sound of hypocrisy and guilt and unpaid debts. Looking for the next family that needs to learn what the Bells learned in blood and terror and 3 years of darkness. Legends don't die. They wait.